In Navajo culture, a skinwalker, or Yi Nallushi, which is translated to mean, with it, he goes on all fours, is a type of harmful witch who has the ability to turn into, possess, or disguise themselves as an animal. The term is never used for healers. I will make you serve your enemies in a land that you do not know. For in my anger a fire is kindled that shall burn forever. The Skinwalker doesn't originate from North America. In fact, it's an ancient dark practice that comes from Canaan. The tribes of Canaan practiced in dark magic, creating giants like Rephaim. You can learn about that practice in the whole chessboard video segment 3. I have a different theory on the resurgence of giants, and it's relevant to our understanding of the human body today. It is eloquent and maintains biblical integrity that all Nephilim died in the flood. God left the Hebrews roaming the Sea of Reeds for 40 years, and some of the tribes of Canaan had not fully condemned themselves through enough sin to warrant removal. Remember, God is just. We know that the tribes of Canaan sacrificed to their gods, but why keep doing this horrible thing if it doesn't produce obvious, visual, and undeniable results? It has to be creating an addiction to power and control. Furthermore, it would manufacture an arms race against the other tribes in the lands. In order to build a legion of mighty men, there would have to be rewards of prestige within the tribes, and by participating, you would become a noble within the community, like a knight in a monarchy. By participating and having your family participate, you can grow and prosper. The king of the land would get the most benefit, and his sons becoming the largest through participation of worship to Moloch and Baal. In order to commit great sin to warrant your execution by God, these tribes sacrificed their babies and aborted children to their idols, and fed the blood and raw meat to their growing children. This practice gave these children infusions of growth factor hormones. On top of that, the sins of sexual deviancy, creating the children, and then the abortion and ingestion of the children of the tribes fulfilled their requirements for God to wipe them from the earth. It doesn't explain blue-tinged skin or red hair, which could be a metal toxicity, but this practice and the epigenetic markers explain much of the possible creation of Rephaim. The fallen messengers all learned the lesson of direct sin in the antediluvian times. They must let man corrupt themselves and damn themselves to hell, and that is just what the Rephaim are, corruption to the extreme. And this is how we will see them again, sometime after disclosure and during the tribulation. The tribes didn't just create Rephaim, they also created shapeshifters, like what we call skinwalkers today. You can read about the hints of this in the history about the Amalekites. Amalekite means blood liquor. In 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 3, "Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." The Freemasons teach that this is an example of God's evil, but in fact, this is just the opposite. The Amalekite practice in ritual child sacrifice and dark worship. They practice giant creation and skinwalker creation. In ordering Saul to destroy all of the Amalekite, God is also ordering the ones hiding as animals within the flock. It would be easy for a skinwalker to hide in the multitudes of animals and escape. God wanted the Amalekites destroyed to stop their abominable practices. As the scriptures state, Saul did not kill all as he was commanded. 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 9. But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, and of the oxen, and of the fatted calves, and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction. The result of Saul's presumptions to save the fatted animals for sacrifice to God meant that some of the Amalekites could escape and their practices would continue to grow. Demons were created from the dead Nephilim giants. Nephilim were created when the fallen messengers' watchers came down and mated with the daughters of man in the antediluvian times. This can be read in Genesis 6:4 and in more detail in the first book of Enoch, chapter 7, verse 1. And all the others together with them took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one, and they began to go in unto them, and to defile themselves with them. And they taught them charms, and enchantments, and the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants, whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them, and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds, and beasts, and reptiles, and fish, and to devour one another's flesh, and drink the blood. Then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. Demons are spirits, and spirits can enter the body via doorways opened from sin, or from breaking the laws of God. These laws were given to help man, not constrict man, as these laws existed before Adam in the garden. By obeying the laws of God, you prevent these demons from entering the body, and you resist further sin by refusing them access. If you're following the pattern, you can see how the Masons use Babylon to encourage sin, so the demonic entities can enter and further corrupt you. The corruption continues until eventually people start believing there are 50 genders, or they're an animal of some sort. The job of the Masons is to corrupt and destroy you. Why else do you think that deliverance is becoming illegal? It unties all the work and spellcraft that Masons have done. It destroys the confusion that the demonic realm plants in you. During the time between Moses and King David, there was a war on giants. God wanted to rid the land of these Canaanite abominations. In the book of Joshua, you can read how the Canaanite kings began falling like dominoes. At Jericho, the walls couldn't even protect them from God's wrath. Joshua 6. Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all of the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in." During the 500 years between Moses' Exodus, 1450 BC, and the end of King David's reign, 970 BC, the tribes of Canaan saw the writing on the wall and fled the lands. To avoid further wars, as the population was dwindled, they fled by boat through the Mediterranean Sea and followed the currents of the ocean. You can see today how the current of the ocean naturally carries boats across the oceans and around the world with the current. This is the Volvo ocean race, which relies upon the ocean currents to complete. The ocean currents naturally take you to the islands in the Pacific, and that's just where the tribes of Canaan went when they fled the Hebrews. Canaanite altars can be found along the Pacific Islands, along with the practice of cannibalism and the worship of the owl, also known as Moloch. Scholars disagree on Moloch to some degree, where Moloch is either a Canaanite deity or the actual name of the ritual where children are sacrificed to Baal. For example, performing Moloch to Baal. Canaanite altars have been found all over the earth, but more surprisingly, in the Pacific Islands, and finally landing on what we call today America. The creation of Asherahs, or carved wooden poles, is still practiced today in the Pacific Islands and America. The South American tribes also freely celebrate child sacrifice atop these ziggurats. Ziggurats can also be found throughout the earth, and many have been covered in soil over time, disguising them as mere hills. During these sacrifices, the shaman who killed the children were the only ones allowed on the sacred top of the ziggurat, so that only they could communicate with the demonic realm, showing the same esoteric tendencies like the Freemasons of today, where you must join and become a priest in order to be enlightened. As the Hebrews' population grew in Israel, many began to worship the Canaanite gods and sacrifice to Baal. Numbers 33:52. Then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, and destroy all their figured stones, and destroy all their metal images, and demolish all their high places. Leviticus 26:30. And I will destroy your high places and cut down your incense altars, and cast your dead bodies upon the dead bodies of your idols, and my soul will abhor you. Isaiah 16:12. And when Moab presents himself, when he wearies himself on the high place, when he comes to his sanctuary to pray, he will not prevail. Jeremiah 32:35. They built the high places of Baal in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to offer up their sons and daughters to Moloch, though I did not command them, nor did it enter into my mind, that they should do this abomination, to cause Judah to sin. High places, very simply, were places of worship on elevated pieces of ground. These shrines often included an altar and a sacred object such as a stone pillar or wood pole in various shapes, identified with the object of worship, animals, constellations, goddesses, and fertility deities. It seems that, at times, high places were set up in a spot that had been artificially elevated, such as a giant mound, to differentiate the high places from the hills. Not all high places were for idol worship, such as Abram's altar to Yahweh or the temple in Jerusalem. God would name only one high place where sacrifice was authorized, and that was the tabernacle in the temple of Jerusalem. 2 Chronicles 3:1. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to David his father, at the place that David had appointed, on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. God commanded that all other high places be destroyed. As the Hebrews who worshipped idols fell away from God, they also fell away from his protection. Understand that this isn't God's will, but the natural cause and effect of a rebellious people. It is during these times that the idol-worshipping Hebrews would follow the Canaanite practices and leave Israel on the boats to other lands in the Pacific and into America, either as slaves to the Rephaim or as willing participants. Dr. Laura Sanger talks about Jekyll Island and its location as the current fiat currency Federal Reserve creation in the home of the Rockefellers, called Indian Mound Cottage, which was built over a Canaanite altar. Here is a segment of Tim Bence in conversation with Rob Skiba on Canaanite altars, the Federal Reserve, Part 1. A copy of Part 1 and 2 is in the library in the folder Quest for Truth, in the link in the description of this video.
You know, they had a pier where the boats would come up, and he's just kind of showing me the grounds, and then we go to the museum. And he's talking a lot about the financial stuff and the guys that built it, and each cottage was marked and named. Some of them had been restored. Some of them didn't exist anymore, but they had like a sign that this is where this one was, and that one was built by J.P. Morgan. That one was Rockefellers, and that one was just they had each one of them named. Well, they're all kind of native names, and then they're all got some kind of plaque on who the financial mogul was that had built them, and they're not really elaborate, luxurious mansions. They're just simple cottages for the most part, which was kind of interesting to know that the richest people in the world built them, and they were very low key and almost like a cabin in the woods instead of a luxurious house like you'd expect. And they all had Indian names. So I started asking him about the Indian history of the island, and he lit up. He just was like, that's what he really wanted to talk about, because he loved the Indian history. And so he takes me back to the museum, and he said, we got a lot of stuff on the Indians. He said this was actually like the government main community for a tribe of Indians that don't exist anymore. That tribe was called the Timucas. And I said, well, that's interesting. My name's Tim. And anyway, I didn't know anything about the Timucas. I'm from Oklahoma. I've learned a lot of native history, and I have some native bloodline, but I did not know anything about the Timucas. So I just asked him, please tell me everything that you can tell me about them. There's something about the natives that I feel like I need to know. So he said, well, the Jekyll Island Club was actually built on top of everything that the Indians had. So they just kind of wiped the village out and built the club on top of it. So wherever the chief's house was, there was a cottage now. Wherever the council house was, there was now the Jekyll Island Hotel. And he said everything that's built and visible today is actually sitting right on top of something that was significant in the Indian village when it existed. So he said the fact that this whole place had to go into ruins and then be rebuilt and become an archaeological state park, he said it's actually helped us identify the native history, because the club itself had almost erased that. Mm-hmm. And so I said, well, let's look at the museum. I want to see some of the Indian stuff. So we're looking at arrowheads and spear tips and, just artifacts that they had found, and pottery shards and things, and seashells that they had had. And he's showing me all their stuff in the museum. He shows me some fragments of a weapon that was like an unusual bow. And when I say unusual, I mean that it was like a double curved bow. And that was a very unusual shape of the bow for a native tribe. I had never seen that shape before with an American Indian tribe. And I've seen a lot of bows and arrows. So I asked him, I said, this seems unusual. I've not seen this before. In Oklahoma, every native tribe, the bows would look like a single bow or just a single curve. I said, this is quite extraordinary, especially as far back as this tribe was. So he said, yeah, we found a lot of weapon-type artifacts that we've not seen with other tribes. And I said, well, how do you know these were Native Americans? Maybe they were from somewhere else. He said, oh, no. They were the Timucas, because they're well established along the Florida and Georgia coast. And he said, we got a lot of stuff in 3 or 4 states about them, and they were quite prolific at one time. So he said, we know they're Native Americans. I said, well, all right, what else you got? He said, well, we got some skeletons. He said, you want to see the bones? And I said, well, yeah. That sounds, don't get to see a skeleton very often. I said, are they where we can actually see them, or are they buried? He said, no, they're visible. So they had a burial site that they had been very respectful for when they built the museum. When they found a burial site, they didn't move the bones. They left them where they were, and they just uncovered them to where they were visible, and then they built the museum on top of it. They did basically the same thing with the museum that the Jekyll Island guys had done with their houses. They put a piece of plexiglass over the burial site so you could see it. but they were still trying to respect where the bones were and not move them. And so I'm looking at 4 skeletons of the Timucua chiefs. And they knew they were chiefs just from different things that were buried with them. So all of a sudden I look and I realize, man, these guys are really tall. And I commented to the guy that, you know, how tall are these guys? They look unusually large. And he said, yeah, they're all about 8 or 8.5 foot tall. I was like, well, that doesn't seem like a normal Native American, especially the tribes that I'm familiar with. He said all the Timucuas were unusually tall, even the women. He said, we found other skeletons and, you know, parts of bones out in the grounds. And he said, we've got pretty good evidence that nearly all of them were extraordinarily tall. And I said, well, what is, you know, how do you explain that in relation to other tribes on the Atlantic coast who were not? He said, I don't know. It is an unusual anomaly. He said, oh, by the way, I've got a painting that you might want to see. It's actually the copy of the original. We've got it under lock and key. He said, I got a painting that actually shows the Indians from a group of French colonists that came to the United States before it was U.S. This was right after Columbus. He said that it was the first colony of French folks that came over to try to establish a colony on the coast. And he said they landed in Jekyll Island, and they had some interaction with these Indians, and then they got so appalled by what they saw and witnessed that they fled at night and ended up in San Augustine, Florida, and established that city. So I said, were they the Huguenots who were the French group that established San Augustine? He said, yes. I said, well, I'd like to see that painting then. So he pulls that out. I'm looking at it, and it shows the Indians and all their regalia, and they're dancing around and having some kind of ceremony, and it's got the fire, and it's a typical, either they're having a party or they're having a war scene, and it has some things with the weapons. So I said, gosh, this has got some weapons in it that clearly validates the archaeology that they found. And then I see an altar. And I'm going, I don't know of a Native American tribe anywhere in the country. I know some that had log houses or high places or worshipped, you know, nature in some way, or had totem poles or that kind of stuff. But this one has a stone altar, and it looks a whole lot like the one that I had dealt with in the Middle East. And I'm looking at the picture and I'm going, is this an altar? Is this stone like something they're sacrificing on? Because this guy's holding babies in his hands in this picture. He said, yeah, they're cutting those babies, they're hacking those babies up in that painting. And so when you look at the detail, 2 of the shamans or chiefs are holding a baby up by the ankles, and they're whacking their heads off and spilling the blood on this altar. Mm. And I'm like, sir, I don't want to be disrespectful of your training in archaeological understanding and history, but I don't know of any native tribe that did what I'm seeing here, unless it was an act of war. And this is really, really unusual. And I've seen this type of scene with artifacts over in the Middle East. And I've seen weapons like this over in the Middle East. I said, are you sure this is Native Americans and not some kind of colony that came from over there? And he was convinced they were native. And I said, well, I'd like to show you some things on a few websites that identify artifacts in the Middle East countries, and especially Egypt and Israel and Syria and Jordan area, and some of those spots where there's some of these ancient groups. And I said, this type of altar, this type of religious ceremony, and some of these weapons, I've seen them before over there. Well, he was quite interested in that because he loves Native American history, but he's starting to question maybe I need to dig into this more. That was his comment. So I said, at that point, then I thought, I believe this is why I'm here. I needed to see this and hear about this. At this point, I'm not that concerned about the financial stuff anymore. I'm wanting to know where is this altar. And so I asked him. I said, "Can you take me to this altar? I often pray over these things, and it's very beneficial for the land and for the country and for the people. Can I go to this altar and see it?" He said, "I can take you to the altar, but you can't see it." And I said, "Why can't I see it? Is it buried?" He said, No, it's not buried, but it has a house built on top of it." I said, "Who would be crazy enough to build their house on top of a blood sacrifice altar?" He said, "Well, Rockefeller was." So,
nice.
I just okay, can we go there? And he said, "Yeah, it's just a short walk. Come on." And we've actually, I'd already walked by it. So he said, "I've got the keys." He said, "Normally nobody can go in. The way these things are set up, they're historical homes now. The state of Georgia owns the park. They lease out to another group, the hotel, to run, but the houses are maintained on the National Historical Register, and they're part of the state park. So you can't go in any of them without a guided tour or permission, but you can go look in the windows and walk on the porches and walk all around them. And they're set up inside just like they were when they were actually being used back in the 20s and earlier. So we go over there, and he's got the keys, though. So we go into the house, and he takes me into the parlor, and he says, "Well, I know you're a praying guy, so you probably would like to have a little time to pray." He said, "You're standing right on top of the altar right now. This is the room that is built on top of it." He said, "I'm just going to go over here and sit down for a few minutes and read a newspaper, and I'll let you pray and do whatever you need to do."
Now, this parlor, that's where those guys, J.P. Morgan and all those guys, actually conceived of the Federal Reserve, right? Right over that altar.
That's exactly right. It's the room that they were sitting in when they drew up the entire legislation and plan to pass it that became the Federal Reserve Act.
Wow.
So this was the conception of the Federal Reserve banking system, on the parlor sitting on top of a blood sacrifice altar.
Where babies were sacrificed.
Yes.
In hearing the gifts that Tim offers us in his revelations, we can see that the Timucua tribes had kept the Canaanite teachings. The people were an unnatural 8 and 9 feet tall. The French explorers who stumbled upon the Timucua were understandably so horrified at the Canaanite practices of slaughtering babies and consuming their flesh that they fled the island at night in secret. Today we are taught that the Timucuan people were savagely killed by Europeans, and nothing of their human sacrifice and cannibalism was shared until it resurfaced recently. Naturally, this European slaughter is the Mason practice of division, because if any people group discovers child sacrifice and their consumption, they would be rightly stopped and destroyed. But it's better for the Masons to keep men divided over race, which is a Masonic invention, so they can be more easily controlled. It is believed that the majority of the Timucua people fled to Cuba with the Spanish in 1763. Tom Horn has a book called On the Path of the Immortals, which talks of the Anasazi with a third-generation medicine man named Dr. Don Mose Jr. Oral tradition talks of tribal people being indistinguishable to the cannibals except for having 6 fingers. And if you were caught with 6 fingers, you were outed as a cannibal and executed.
During research for our best-selling book, On the Path of the Immortals, I was given the unprecedented opportunity, really, to sit down with and to film Dr. Don Mose Jr., a third-generation medicine man who I met with for a large part of the day. And he told me the oldest legends of the Anasazi, which he had been told by his great-grandfather, who likewise had been told by his ancestors, which included stories of the Anasazi turning to sorcery, to sacrifice, cannibalism, after they had lost their way and were driven insane by a reptilian creature, which they depict with a halo above his head, of all things. Images of that being are, by the way, included in the petroglyphs that we filmed inside the canyons, and I believe that they likely attest to the fallen reptile or reptiles of biblical fame, which also misled humanity. As I said in the traditional Hogan at one of the Navajo schools Dr. Don Mose teaches at, he began drawing in the sand on the floor and reciting the first part of the story of the ancient Anasazi and how it had been repeated to him by his father and grandfather, who had also been told by their ancestors and so on, a legend that Dr. Mose alone had undoubtedly repeated hundreds of times before at the Navajo school. Now, since it was obvious to us that this Navajo historian was really indifferent to our camera and our recording plans, and in fact I could tell he was really uncomfortable with us putting him on film, but thankfully he let us proceed nevertheless. But I sat there and listened respectfully as he proceeded for nearly 2 hours to describe to this white man what's only ever been allowed a few times in history before, and that is the legendary stories of creation, of giants, of a great flood, of a reptilian deceiver, all from the voice of the nation's top medicine man. Dr. Mose even sang to us in the antiquated tongue of what I would call Old Testament history, paralleled in their earliest antiquity using the Navajo language. Now, not only did Dr. Mose substantiate the age-old and globally recorded story of those who come through portals and the impact that they have had on biblical and global history, past and present, not only did he weave Navajo Indian myths and legends seamlessly with our understanding of the 6 days of creation, the arrival of the Nephilim, and their connection to judgment by a global flood, followed by the repopulating of people around the world, and then a second incursion of the giants. But there were several instances in which, when I pushed Dr. Mose for greater detail, he would go off script, actually delineating from the official Navajo storyline to provide greater consistency between history and the way the Bible itself recorded certain events.
This is part of a ritual. A ritual sacrifice?
As Mose was following the official storyline, the one that you would get from the Parks Department in the four corners of the U.S., about how the Anasazi didn't disappear, but rather they slowly migrated out of the area and became the modern Pueblo Indians, I expressed doubts to Dr. Mose about that story. And he responded by grinning just a little bit and saying, well, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but, and then he proceeded to tell us the older stories that his grandfather had repeated about these mysterious people actually disappearing after they came under mind control from a reptile with a halo, this carnivorous creature, suspiciously similar to what I later described in the Path of the Immortals book as fiery seraphim, which comes from the Hebrew seraph, the Hebrew Old Testament fiery serpent, which also corresponds with a lot of other testaments around the ancient world, including the Sanskrit sarpa or sarpin, which means reptile, and so on. Now, another case in point is when I told Dr. Mose what we had learned from the Apache about cannibalistic giants and then God destroying them in a flood. And he looks right into the camera and he says, oh yes. And then he reaches over and he picks up this illustrated book that he had authored that's used in the Navajo Nation schools and libraries. And he opened to show us an artist depiction of a giant that had stood between 30 and 40 feet tall. And then he starts saying there was this time when the earth was infested with such great giants and alien gods that came down and destroyed and ate the people. Some of them were in human form. Others, he said, were monsters like human-animal hybrids, which I think the Old Testament also describes. And then he followed that story with the famous Navajo legend of the White Shell Woman, who gave birth to two of the most important characters in Navajo mythology, the twin miracle-performing sons, one of whose names literally translates slayer of alien gods, and his twin brother. And together, those two great warriors killed many of the giants, hybrids, and the monsters that were destroying mankind. As Dr. Mose described these ancient tales, I couldn't help but think of David killing Goliath, and then later other giants with his mighty men. Then there was a point where Mose paused, and he said, you know, when the Christian missionaries first came to America and told our people their stories of the giants and the great flood, he said, we smiled and let them know that we already knew these stories, that they had been told to us long ago by our own ancestors. We were finally on our way to the last site that we were going to visit, one that our Cherokee guide had told us not to miss. We already collected enough pictogram and logogram images from ancient rock engravings throughout the Four Corners area to make our case and to calculate for our purposes a recurring theme, which definitely seemed to match the Middle Eastern and biblical stories of portals, reptilians, fallen angels, giants, and the havoc that those creatures had played on the old world. But this final petroglyph that was important, our guide had said, and one that we could drive right up to. So we decided to make one final excursion, this time into Utah, 50 miles north of Moab, where one of the largest known collections of petroglyphs is located in the San Juan County. This storyboard that we would visit there was etched in sandstone as early as 1,000 years before Christ, and it records practically every element contained in the Bible and extra-biblical texts involving spiral vortices and those who come through them, including human-animal chimeras and even giant six-fingered and six-toed footprints in pursuit of much smaller five-fingered and five-toed humans. Even that reptilian that Dr. Don Mose had described to us with its halo was drawn there, just a couple of feet away from the alien-looking bug-eyed creatures. This location is also easier to get to than most of the ones that we trekked to, yet it's as important, if not more so, than any petroglyphs. You could spend days hiking over miles of rough terrain to reach. It's called the Newspaper Rock Petroglyph, and is somewhat decipherable as to which images are older due to the fading and darkness of the earlier depictions, which are certainly the most mysterious with their alien-looking creatures and suits and what might even be some type of a flying craft. And archaeologists believe the writing on this Great Wall continued from 1,000 years before Christ or earlier up until about AD 1300, the same time that the Anasazi suddenly disappeared. The Anasazi used images and symbols similar to those found globally that connect to a first and second incursion of giants and the mountainous gateways that those creators came through. Now, that being true, if you take only the images that the Anasazi left behind and compare them to similar, in some cases identical, universal symbols found elsewhere around the world where the stories and meanings of the images have been made clear, and keeping in mind that these legends materialized globally at approximately the same time. When the Torah, that is Genesis through Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Bible, was written around BC 1300, this would have been the same time when archaeologists believe the Anasazi across the world from these Bible lands were drawing giant, 6-toed footprints on a slab wall in Utah and facing an alien enemy, as the name Anasazi implies. When the writings in the Torah are compared with other ancient texts, including Enoch, Jubilees, Baruch, Genesis Apocryphon, Philo, Josephus, Jasher, Jubilees, and many others, not counting the accounts of the American Indian tribes on this side of the world, it's clear that this is more than a legend. It is history. It's a chronicle told through different people's methods and worldviews involving giants suddenly infesting the entire world and then being wiped out in a flood, then somehow returning in a second incursion. This story was written down globally, from Hebrew scrolls to Indian petroglyphs, to provide the oldest recorded testament of part human, part angelic creatures who were in turn the offspring of hideous reptilian entities, or what the apocryphal book of Enoch calls fallen watchers. In the beginning, the great creator made everything. Then powerful reptilians came down from heaven through portals, the spiral, halo, and reptilian symbols that we found in the petroglyphs. They came to deceive the world, as Dr. Don Mose told us, and the world fell into darkness. This is also hinted in one of the meanings of the word Anasazi, which can literally be translated, according to the experts that we discuss this with, as an alien enemy. Portals, represented in ancient spiral symbolism besides giant 6-toed footprints and horned humanoid figures, opened at this time, and alien gods or monsters and giants came through them. Some of these giants had 6 fingers and 6 toes, just as described in the Old Testament. Then the Creator destroyed the monsters and giants in a great flood. And yet the giants and reptilian deceivers returned. They turned to sorcery, to cannibalism, and human sacrifice.
The Anasazi was a people that were so very different from the Ne. There's a lot of stories and that have been shared with our families and that down through the years, but a lot of it is not being passed on. And so this area, all the way down from the bottom of this canyon, is called Jekyll. But the old people used to refer to it as Jekyll, which is to say the place in the high rock areas. Jekyll is then referred to as the place of crying, and that's where the word Jekyll means the place of crying. And our people had a name for this area, and it was a very evil place after all of the people that had practiced slavery and so many other things that were so horrible that when the holy people finally destroyed them, they caused the rocks to cave in, and they caused the big winds to dry up all of the wells and that were in this area. And so Jekyll is still considered a place of crying and dying. And so this is where we're at. Now the Ne, when they talk about these what's called the Kivas, back in the time of the Anasazi, some of these places were actually altars that were made by the slaves and that were actually places that they would do their human sacrifices. This was completely enclosed, so it was completely dark, telling about how they worship the darkness. But so the Inde is what we are told, which means that their prayers were offered to the darkness. And so this is one of those places that is a location that would be probably sacrificing altars and that.
Next, there are discoveries of giant mounds all over South and North America. Blurry Creatures has an excellent interview called I Dug Up Giant Bones. It is a two-part discussion.
We lived about 55 miles southeast of here before, and my wife wanted to come back to her home area because her family is here. So that's when we found this place, and we had to have it. Really kind of remote for this area, half-mile driveway and so forth. And in the southeast corner of the property was an old gravel pit, so we got mounds and hills all over the place. So I didn't recognize the ancient mounds because there's so much of this modern scatter around. So we bought the place, moved in here, and needed gravel to backfill the basement wall. So I couldn't get to the gravel pit because the field, there's crops on the field. I couldn't get in there. So I just went down the ridge a ways and started digging. Well, I knew there'd be gravel there because there's gravel all over up there. So I stockpiled the gravel, came back later with an ATV cart and whatever, started, backfilled the wall, and then I stockpiled some gravel. And that's when I found the bones. I didn't find them using a backhoe, digging the stuff up and stockpiling it. It's when I was shoveling into the ATV cart is when I seen it looks like a human rib bone and other bones. So then I called in the authorities. And they came out and then they called in the state archaeologist. And I tried to stay with them as much as I possibly could so I could see what's in there. And I was supposed to get a report, archaeological report and so forth. And they were taking pictures and whatever, so I thought they had everything covered, So, first week we thought we changed history because, this is, and I got the Wilford report, and the Wilford report says it's not native, it's alien. Not aliens that fly around up in the sky, but it's alien, it's different.
Roger's not Native American, right? Is that what it means when he says alien?
Exactly.
Okay.
And I can send you that report too, or did I already? I don't think I did that one.
I don't think we got that one.
Wait, so let me backtrack just a bit here, Roger. So you're backfilling some gravel for your house, and you end up seeing bones sticking out of the mound, and they're big.
No, I didn't see bones sticking out of the mound. We didn't see that until after they dug down and unearthed the two girls. I took their right shoulder and rib cage off with the backhoe, and I took the big guy's feet off, and I stockpiled that gravel. And later on, I came in with an ATV trailer and that, and I was shoveling, and that's when I hit the bones. I had already dug them up and stockpiled them. I didn't realize that.
So people listening, a lot of times when a giant is found, they're often buried with Native Americans, right, at their feet.
Yep. Yeah, the girls were definitely Native American. Yeah, they were a smaller, petite clan. They were in a fetal position with their hands over their face, shoved up against his feet with orca on them, red string, soul trapper.
Wow.
Just wanted to see the history coming out, and they seemed very interested too, and they were stunned that it was the Wilford report. And I told them about the Vikings and stuff, so, that this is what they do. So we thought we totally found something new, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Until the next week, they missed Monday, and they came out Tuesday, and then they were zip-lipped. They wouldn't talk about any Viking stuff or anything like that. So apparently somebody had to talk with
Roger, what gave it away to you initially that it was a giant? It was something bigger than... I mean, obviously they came back with a report saying it wasn't native. Were those just big feet? I mean, when you say you got the feet, were they huge?
Well, I dug the feet off. They were
right.
busted up in the gravel.
Oh, okay.
But his shin bones were sticking out of the side of the gravel. The gal there was all excited. She said, "This is a very, very large male." And I could see, it's way out of proportion to what the girls were for bone size.
How big do you think that shin bone was?
I'd say 1/4 of the shin bone was sticking out. See, it wasn't uncovered. It was just a shin bone sticking out. So how do you know,
Yeah.
But later on, when we came back and Leonard doused it, the whole grave with the girls curled up at his feet was 120 inches. And they didn't take up more than 1.5 or 2 foot. That's how petite these girls were.
12 feet. I mean, yeah.
Wherever a giant mound is discovered and reported, the land falls under the protection or jurisdiction of the government and Indian Affairs. This happened to Roger when he reported the giant mound after digging up giant bones while trying to build on his property. The mounds are made up with giant bones at the bottom and typically regular-sized bodies buried with the giant. This is similar to Egyptian pharaohs, who are entombed with servants and personal items. Giant mounds are also found throughout Israel and the Middle East. In 1994, Dr. Robert O. Young captured something quite extraordinary under the microscope. He captured a red blood cell transformed before his very eyes into a raw bacteria, such as anthrax, and then biologically transformed back into a targeted red blood cell. In 1996, Dr. Young captured this again from a 42-year-old with his live blood under phase contrast microscopy, showing the birth of bacteria from a red blood cell and then giving birth to a Y-form yeast like Candida albicans. Both of these transformations happened in an irregular acidic environment within the human body. By changing the natural environment of the body into an acidic environment caused an alarming change. This helped Dr. Young prove that disease is an internal factor and not an external factor. The acidic body was the catalyst for the change, but I am not saying that the entire body can be altered by changing the pH levels. This is just a fine example of cells changing form. So, what it does show is the possibility of cells altering their appearance under certain conditions. If cells are placed under a more organized and controlled frequency environment, it could be easy to see them change from one form to another. This is also how medbeds will work and can help explain how skinwalkers can change their body formations. But it is important to include how skinwalkers are created to better understand the organized pleomorphism that is occurring with them. It is easy to see the dark arts in skinwalkers from the history presented, but to really understand the monstrous practice, one must know how they are formed. The Canaanite practice starts with a ritual to summon a specific demonic entity, meaning that the individual seeks out and desires this power. Then an exchange is made with the demonic entity where this future witch bargains their soul and life force to the demon. The bargain requires the most evil of deeds.
Darkness and evil said, "Come here. I know how to make you shapeshift real easy, but there's a couple things that you have to do to be able to obtain this power." So some people were just like, well, what do you have to do? There's certain steps and ceremonies you have to do to be able to learn how to shapeshift the way we do. First off, you have to sacrifice a loved one, an immediate loved one, whether that be your lover, your mother, your father, your sister, your brother, or your child, or your grandparents. Somebody that you love and hold close and dear to your heart. You'd have to take them out into the reservation, into the darkness, and you would have to sacrifice them to be able to first step and to obtain this power. Now I know this is really dark, this is really gruesome, but this is the truth of how Yanagloshi has become to be. So, there's some other steps that you have to take that I'm not going to actually disclose to you because a lot of that is very gruesome, and I'm not going to go into detail because a lot of it we're going to keep sacred here. But once you complete all these tasks, you're able to learn how to shapeshift into evil and darkness.
The killing of a close family member or the one they love the most. In committing this act, the witch has corrupted or cursed themselves so much that the demon can then enter the body like a parasite. The demon then grants the power to transform into any pelt the witch owns, although most commonly the animal is a coyote, wolf, cougar, fox, owl, or crow. They literally have become humans who have acquired immense supernatural power through the demon, including the ability to transform into animals and other people. If the witch fails to kill the one they love the most, the bargain made previously allows the demon to kill the witch, as a sacrifice must happen one way or another.
This is where it gets kind of creepy, because I've always heard stories about what happens in those dark tunnels, or dark canyons I should say. And when we were walking through there, man, it was just like a blanket of darkness. It was midday, but you could just feel the draining energy of your good thoughts, your good memories just kind of seep out of your body into the rock face itself. And when you're walking through there, we were able to see at the very end kind of like a little dome area where the water carved out a perfect circular cave. And in there were bones. There were cattle bones, horse bones, and sheep bones, and I'd have to say, but I think unfortunately there were human bones inside of there as well. So we're just like, okay, so there are human remains in here too. So with that, we saw some markings and some other distinct things that I'm not going to go into, unfortunately, but you could tell it was active. So this was one of those places where the Yanagloshis would do their initiations into becoming a skinwalker and doing their ceremonies, what they need to do. So we're just like, okay, our patient is just a mile south of here, you know, which would understandably make him an easy target. So we returned back to the home, and we're just like, we're going to wait for nightfall to be able to go into that shack and see what's going on. And so nightfall comes, we get ready, we get our weapons, we get everything ready, because with that being so close, that would mean that if we start to disturb with any evil or darkness that's there, some things they may not want us to see. They may want to keep secret. There's a reason why there's, I guess you can say, a barrier over that little shack. They might be protecting something in there. And this would have been when I was 16, 17 years old, so a couple years after the Skinwalker Tunnel incident. If you haven't seen that, I got that video. I'll put it right here as well. Go check that out. That's going to be my first time seeing Skinwalker tunnels. But going back to the story, I was very young still, very, very kind of immature. So we went to the shack. It would have to have been like 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening. Sun was already down, and there were clouds over us. So we couldn't see the moon. We couldn't see the stars. It was just dark. So we pull up our vehicles in front of the shack, and we turn on our headlights, and we look in there. And my brother and my uncle, they came up to me and they told me, wait outside, because you're still young, because you're not as experienced as us in this, whatever could be in there could get you sick. So just wait until you get your trainings up a little bit more, then you'll be able to go inside of these things. So I said, okay. I didn't argue, you know, I understood what dangers lay inside. So I waited outside. They said, make sure nothing comes running in at us from behind us to try to stop us from what we're doing. So I remember I was standing there, and what was A disadvantage to me was because the vehicles all had their headlights on me, so I couldn't really see past that. So if something were to come running out at me, then a Yanagloshi would come running at me, I would only have a split second to be able to respond, to be able to stop it from going in there. And that made me tense. It was, I would have to say it was around summertime, so it wasn't cold, but I remember just gripping my sword tightly to make sure that nothing was able to make its way to them. You know, they relied on me. They put their trust in me to be able to stop whatever goes in there. And so my brother told me what happened afterwards, what they did inside there. So this is what happened. So they opened the door to the shack, and inside were 3 chests. And if you can imagine, these chests were, I would have to say, very vintage in their look. They were, all 3 of them were stacked up. And when they opened that door, there was a kind of a rotten smell to the whole place, a smell of death. So when they opened that door, they went to the chests above and they were like, okay, the contents of the evil items should be inside these chests. So they get the first chest and they open it up, and there's just a bunch of clothes, you know, little knickknacks here and there, nothing too evil, nothing too dark. And so they grab that chest, they move it out of the way, and they make their way to the second chest. And, you know, me standing outside, I can kind of hear them, you know, they're like, okay, nothing's in here, let's open up the second one. So when they opened up the second one, that's when it got scary. Was because when they opened up that second chest, you heard a woman scream. And what's wild about it is the only contents inside of that chest were 4 stones, 4 sacred stones, and a piece of bone, and a picture as well. So inside of that chest, those stones are very sacred to our tribe, but also including a bone inside of there represents a darkness of the twisted representation of our holy stones and our holy objects. And with that picture that was inside of there was a picture of a woman inside of that as well. So we were thinking that, like, dang, was her spirit kept in that box this whole time? Was she trying to find her way out? So my brother and my uncle, they use buckhide gloves, and they grab the items and they put it inside of a bag. So they said, okay, so let's go ahead and move to the last chest. So when they made their way to the last chest, I remember hearing a gasp from my uncle and my brother. They're like, what is that? What is that? And I could just feel out in the darkness, I could feel eyes looking at me. You could see or feel, you know, people looking at you. And I was just like, this isn't good. So I told them, I was like, hey, there's people out here, just be ready. And they said, okay. So what was inside that last chest was the regalia of a Yanagloshi. They gathered up the regalia and they took it back to the home, outside of the home. Never bring evil things in your home. They took it outside of the home and they started a fire. And this is when my brother showed me the regalia. He showed me the buckhide skin rolled out, and he flipped it over, and on the inside of the skin were markings. There was blood markings, ash markings, and burn marks inside of there that represent a lot of the Skinwalker signage, language, and symbols that they use to be able to shapeshift into these evil things. And also attached with those things were 2 pairs of antlers. And on these antlers was very interesting because they had blood. It was 4 blood drops on there. And each of those blood drops on the antlers represents somebody that you've killed. So this person, in their time of being a Skinwalker, had killed 4 people. And I remember just being near that regalia, I had to vomit. I had to throw up because it was just so, had a weird smell to it, and just the energy off of it was very disorienting. So my brother said, okay, need to start a fire. What we need to do is we are going to burn these items and these things, and the ceremony that we're going to be doing is calling upon the spirit of the buck that was killed. And unfortunately, when you kill something for evil like that, the buck has its sacred stories, has its protections as well for doing holy things. But when the buck was killed for these evil acts, it's not happy. Its soul is not happy. So when you were able to put those stuff in the fire, you do the ceremony, you do the songs, you're able to summon the spirit of the buck and send it back to whoever killed it to do whatever it needs to do. So my brother, he told me, be ready, because those things that are out there are going to want to stop what we're doing. They don't want that spirit to run free. They don't want that spirit to go back at them. So they're going to do everything in their power to try to stop us. I said, okay. So my brother sat by the fire. He did the ceremony of having the skin go to the fire. And I remember when he was singing, doing his songs, I was vigilant. I was looking around. And in this house, they had a porch light that was pretty good, but it only went a certain distance to where you can kind of see the outline of how far the light reached. And I remember looking over to my left, and I remember seeing a dark shadow at the edge of that light, kind of just walking back and forth. Sure enough, I look to my right, and I see it again, another one, kind of just walking at the edge of the light like that, going back and forth. I whistled to my uncle, who was on the other side. He's like, I see him. So we pull out our swords and we stand guard for my brother to make sure nothing happens. And they got close, and as my brother was beginning to finish up the ceremony, you can hear them. They blow their whistles. They start doing their war whoops, and they were. I feel like they were about to head straight for us, make a beeline for us. But as my brother grew closer to this, releasing that spirit, you see them run. You see them take off back toward the cliff where they came from. And with that, they understood and they knew the ceremony that he was doing, and they knew that spirit was gonna come out of the buckskin. So when my brother finished up the ceremony, that spirit went out. And when that spirit went out, way at the distance at the cliffside, you hear a scream right afterwards.
Having an understanding of the anatomy of a skinwalker can help you target these horrific witches through prayer. Basically, understanding what their power comes from, the demonic entity, can help you see that the strength is also its massive weakness. Look into the gang-stalking prayers and territorial warfare prayers. The Navajo, Ute, Pueblo, Apache, and Hopi have their legends of shapeshifters, but the ability varies slightly from the land due to the powers and principalities in control of that land. But most interestingly, tracing the practice back to the Amalekites tells us that there is a very good sign that Native Americans were one of the first 12 tribes of Jacob who abandoned God for the false idols, and in doing so, God allowed them to fall under Canaanite rule and ended up in faraway lands. Jeremiah 16, verse 10-13. And when you tell this people all these words, and they say to you, why has the Lord pronounced all this great evil against us? What is our iniquity? What is the sin that we have committed against the Lord our God? Then you shall say to them, because your fathers have forsaken me, declares the Lord, and have gone after other gods, and have served and worshipped them, and have forsaken me, and have not kept my law, and because you have done worse than your fathers. For behold, every one of you follows his stubborn, evil will, refusing to listen to me. Therefore, I will hurl you out of this land, into a land that neither you nor your fathers have known, and there you shall serve other gods day and night. For I will show you no favor. To this day, many North American native cultures still practice some semblance of Canaanite worship with false idols, wooden poles, and carvings, and nature worship. However, the times we are in today, we shall see God calling these tribes to come back to Him through dreams, visions, and prophecy. Jeremiah 30, chapter 10 and 11. Then fear not, O Jacob my servant, declares the Lord, nor be dismayed, O Israel, for behold, I will save you from far away, and your offspring from the land of their captivity. Jacob shall return and have quiet and ease, and none shall make him afraid. For I am with you to save you, declares the Lord. I will make a full end of all the nations among whom I scattered you. But of you I will not make a full end. I will discipline you in just measure, and I will by no means leave you unpunished.